Before the Kray Twins became symbols of London gangster history, they had already proved to be two soldiers the army simply could not control. In 1952, the brothers were called up for national service, but instead of obeying orders, they went absent without leave, defied authority, assaulted men in uniform, and were eventually sent to military prison. Even behind bars, they carried on causing trouble, attacking guards, and resisting every rule placed in front of them. A few years later, they returned to the East End in sharp suits, opened clubs, moved into the West End, and were photographed like celebrities. But behind those lights stood the firm protection rackets, intimidation, fear, and, in the end, a flat in Stoke Newington. That was where Jack the McVitie, a man from their own world, was lured after failing to carry out a job. Ronnie was there. Reggie pulled out a gun, aimed it at Jack's head, and pulled the trigger. The gun did not fire. He tried again, still nothing. But Jack was not allowed to walk away. Someone held him down, and Reggie turned to a knife. That night, it was not only one man who died. The firm began to understand that if Jack could be dealt with like that, then anyone could be next. This was the moment that showed just how terrifying the Kray Twins had become, and why even the underworld itself began to fear them. And it was also the moment that made the two legends pay the price from the night Jack was killed. Everything began to fall apart. Join Crime Britain archives as we take a deep dive into the lives of the Kray Twins, from their early days in the East End to the glamour of London S-clubs and the violent underworld hidden behind their sharp suits. How feared were the Kray Twins that London once had to take notice? And why did the very brutality that built their reputation eventually drag them towards a dead end? Ronnie and Reggie Kray were born on 24 October 1933 and grew up in London's East End, in a working-class environment where children often learned to look after themselves from an early age. The streets around Bethnal Green offered little room for weakness. In that part of London, a boy's reputation could sometimes begin with a simple question: would he stand his ground when challenged? Boxing presented a possible route in a different direction. The twins, trained from a young age, possessed genuine ability and were at one stage regarded as promising amateur fighters. Yet boxing did not instill lasting discipline. Instead, it provided them with another skill: the ability to use their fists more effectively. Reggie was often described as the calmer of the two. He was more measured, more willing to listen to advice, and more likely to approach a confrontation with calculation rather than impulse. Ronnie was different. He was known for his aggression, his willingness to move directly towards an opponent, and his tendency to treat disputes as intensely personal matters. Even in their youth, those differences were becoming apparent. One preferred control, the other was more inclined towards disruption. Yet despite their contrasting personalities, both shared a common problem. No authority, institution, or set of rules seemed capable of holding their attention for very long. In 1952, Ronnie and Reggie Kray were called up for national service. For many young men of their generation, military service was intended to provide structure, discipline, and a sense of responsibility. For the Kray Twins, however, it quickly became another setting in which they resisted authority. Shortly after arriving at their unit, the brothers decided they had no intention of remaining there. They left without permission, treating military regulations as though they did not apply to them. During the incident, a serviceman attempted to stop them. Ronnie responded by striking him in the jaw. The twins then made their way back to the East End. The matter was not ignored. The following day, police officers located the brothers, arrested them, and returned them to military custody. What followed was a period in the military detention system, during which Ronnie and Reggie were held at a number of establishments, including the Tower of London, Shepton Mallet, and Canterbury. Their time in detention did little to change their behaviour. Reports from the period describe repeated acts of disruption, defiance, and resistance to authority. Rather than adapting to the discipline expected of them, the brothers continued to challenge those placed in charge of them, earning a reputation that extended beyond their immediate surroundings. Long before the formation of the firm, this period revealed an important pattern. Attempts to impose discipline on the Kray twins consistently failed. Instead of altering their direction, those experiences appeared to reinforce their hostility towards authority and move them further towards a life of criminality. After leaving military service, Ronnie and Reggie Kray did not return to boxing, nor did they pursue conventional employment. Instead, with money borrowed from their older brother Charlie, they acquired a run-down billiard club in the East End. It was neither prestigious nor influential, but it provided the twins with their first meaningful foothold in the local criminal landscape. The club attracted a regular crowd of small-time offenders and individuals operating on the fringes of the law. Within that environment, the brothers began to understand how a seemingly ordinary business could serve several purposes at once. It could generate income, establish connections, and project a reputation that others would think twice about challenging. At first, the Krays were not operating entirely on their own. During the late 1950s, they became associated with J. Murray, an influential figure from Liverpool. Through those connections, the brothers became involved in a range of criminal activities, including vehicle theft, armed robbery, and arson. The profits generated from those offences allowed them to expand their interests, acquiring additional clubs and other assets across London. It was during this period that the firm began to take shape. Reggie increasingly focused on business interests, personal relationships, and the appearance of legitimacy. Ronnie, by contrast, was more closely associated with intimidation and direct violence. From the outside, the organisation appeared to be growing in influence and confidence, yet, from the very beginning, its foundations were unstable. The firm was built on criminal proceeds maintained through fear and shaped by the conflicting personalities of the two men at its centre. The Kray twins did not simply want to make money in the shadows, they wanted to be seen. After moving into the West End, particularly through clubs such as Esmeralda S. Barn, Ronnie and Reggie Kray entered a very different world. It was a world of show business, famous names, carefully staged photographs, and social connections that made them appear more powerful than their criminal reach truly was. This was one of the things that set the Krays apart from many other villains of their era. They did not build their reputation only through fear in the East End. They also constructed an image through the press, nightclubs, sharp suits, and celebrity circles. In the public imagination, the brothers gradually became something unusual. Part criminal figures, part cultural symbols, but attention carried its own risks. A professional criminal usually survives by remaining in the background, by ensuring that outsiders know as little as possible. The Krays moved in the opposite direction. They enjoyed being photographed, being mentioned, and being seen as men who appeared to stand beyond the reach of ordinary rules. The visibility helped their legend grow, but it also made their mistakes harder to conceal. When a criminal spends too long in the spotlight, the police no longer have to wonder where to look. Ronnie and Reggie mistook attention for power. In time, that would become one of the first visible cracks in the Kray legend. Đoạn này đã ổn rồi. Mình chỉnh lại cho tự nhiên hơn, đúng nhịp British documentary hơn, và tránh lặp cảm xúc quá mạnh. Frances Shay should not be treated as a minor detail in Reggie Kray's life. She was part of the real tragedy behind the polished image later attached to the Kray family by newspapers, books, and films. Frances met Reggie when she was still very young. By 1965, their wedding had become a public event, almost a snapshot of swinging London. Smart suits, wedding photographs, notoriety, and the impression that Reggie Kray was stepping into the role of a respectable family man. But behind that carefully presented image, the marriage began to break down quickly. Within months, Frances had returned to her mother's home. What followed showed that she was not simply living alongside Reggie. She was also living under the weight of the wider Kray family. The pressure, fear, control, and atmosphere surrounding the twins made her life one of the most painful parts of this story. Frances was not an accessory to a gangster legend. She was a reminder that criminal glamour does not only damage rivals or enemies, it can also consume those closest to it. On 9 March 1966, George Cornell walked into the Blind Beggar, a pub in the East End. Cornell was linked to the Richardson gang, the Kray's rivals. Tensions between the two groups had already escalated after a shooting at a nightclub in which Richard Hart, a Kray associate, had been killed. Cornell was not arrested over that incident, as he had not been present at the scene. After visiting the injured in hospital, he went to the Blind Beggar with a friend, but word of Cornell's whereabouts soon reached Ronnie Kray. Ronnie entered the pub with an associate. This was not an ambush carried out in darkness. It was a public act committed in front of witnesses. When Cornell saw Ronnie, he is said to have remarked, "Well, just look who is here." Then the shot was fired. Cornell was shot inside the pub. At first, fear kept the room silent, but a killing carried out before witnesses could not remain hidden indefinitely. In time, Cornell's death became one of the key events that helped bring the Krays down. Frank Mitchell was not an ordinary associate. He was regarded as one of the most violent prisoners in Britain, and that reputation drew the attention of Ronnie Kray. While Ronnie was in prison, he became acquainted with Mitchell and later proposed helping him escape. Reggie was reluctant to become involved. He understood that Mitchell was not the kind of man who could be easily controlled, but in the end, he agreed. On 12 December 1966, Mitchell was outside with a group of prisoners on a work detail. He asked a guard for permission to move away from the group so he could feed some ponies. Once allowed to do so, he walked towards a nearby lane, where a car arranged by the Krays was waiting. Mitchell got in and was taken straight back to London. At first, the escape may have seemed like an opportunity to strengthen the Krays' reputation. But within a short time, Mitchell became a serious liability. He was hidden in a flat while police, and even RAF helicopters, searched for him. Mitchell did not want to return to prison, but he was also unwilling to remain confined indefinitely. The Krays could not release him, and they could not return him to custody without exposing their own involvement. By 24 December 1966, a member of the firm named Donahue told Mitchell to get into a van, supposedly so he could be moved to a quieter location where he would meet Ronnie. Once the doors were closed, armed men inside opened fire. Mitchell's body was later weighed down with wire mesh and thrown into the English Channel. The Krays had hoped to use Mitchell to enhance their standing. Instead, they created a problem they could no longer control. Jack the Hat McVitie was connected to the firm. He was not some distant enemy from the streets. He had been given a job by the Krays to deal with Leslie Payne, a man who had once helped the twins with their business affairs. McVitie accepted the money, but the job was not carried out, and the money was not returned. For Ronnie and Reggie, this was not simply a failure, it was an act of defiance. In 1967, McVitie was lured to a flat in Stoke Newington under the pretense of a meeting. When he entered, Ronnie Kray was already there. The atmosphere changed immediately. Ronnie began abusing McVitie, then used a piece of broken glass to injure him beneath the eye. The situation escalated quickly. Reggie Kray took out a gun, pointed it at McVitie's head, and pulled the trigger. The gun failed to fire. He pulled the trigger again. Still, no shot was fired. That moment might have brought the violence to a halt. But inside that flat, no one removed McVitie from danger. One of the men present held him in place. Reggie then turned to a knife and stabbed McVitie repeatedly until he died. The killing marked a serious fracture within the firm. McVitie belonged to their own world. If Jack could be dealt with in that way, then anyone could be next. The Krays had mistaken fear for loyalty, and on that night, the mistake became impossible to ignore. After the killing of Jack McVitie, fear within the firm was no longer directed only at the outside world. It began to turn back towards Ronnie and Reggie themselves. That was when Detective Chief Superintendent Leonard Nipper, Red of Scotland Yard, saw an opportunity. Red had been watching the Krays since 1964, but in the East End, knowing the truth and being willing to say it were two very different things. Witnesses were frightened. Associates stayed silent. The Kray name still carried enough weight to keep many people quiet, but after Cornell, Mitchell, and especially McVitie, that silence began to crack. In the early hours of May 1968, Red led a coordinated police operation that resulted in the arrests of Ronnie, Reggie, and several members of the firm. Reed did not need to defeat the Krays. Through violence, he needed to separate them from the streets and allow the fear inside the organization to change direction. Once the two bosses were in custody, those who had remained silent began to reconsider. Some members of the firm entered negotiations. Witnesses in the Cornell case also came forward. This was the moment when the Kray legend began to pass into the hands of the law. In March 1969, the Kray legend entered the courtroom and encountered something reputation could not intimidate. The law, Ronnie and Reggie, had been turned by the press into symbols of a dangerous and glamorous London. They had clubs, carefully composed photographs, friends in show business, and a name that was strong enough to keep many people in the East End silent. But in court, none of that was enough to protect them. Ronnie was convicted in connection with the murder of George Cornell, who had been shot inside the Blind Beggar. Reggie was convicted in connection with the death of Jack the Hat McVitie, the killing that had helped fracture the firm from within. Internal testimony and the breaking of a silence that had once protected them pulled the twins down from legend into legal reality. Both were sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 30 years. Charlie Kray was also sentenced to 10 years for his role in assisting them. They entered the courtroom as symbols. They left it as two men convicted of murder. After the sentences, the Kray legend no longer belonged to the clubs, the press, or the West End. It was locked behind bars. Ronnie became a category, a prisoner, held under tight control, and was later transferred to Broadmoor Hospital in 1979, when his paranoid schizophrenia could no longer be ignored. The man who had once spread fear through the East End spent the rest of his life in a high-security hospital until his death on 17 March 1995 at the age of 61. Reggie spent many years in prison, with repeated applications for parole refused. He was held at Maidstone and later at Gangland Prison. In 2000, he was released on compassionate grounds because of serious illness, but lived for only around 8 more weeks before his death on 1 October, at the age of 66. Although their funerals drew crowds, that did not alter the colder truth. Both men spent most of their lives behind bars, while their victims and the families left behind were never given the chance to rewrite the story. The Kray twins did not fall because they lacked fear. They fell because they created too much of it around themselves, until even those who had once stood behind them could no longer endure it. Ronnie and Reggie mistook the spotlight for power. They believed that clubs, newspapers, famous faces, and carefully composed photographs could make them untouchable. But the more a gangster steps into the light, the easier it becomes for the police to know where to look. They also mistook silence for loyalty. For a time, the East End stayed quiet because people were afraid. But after George Cornell, Frank Mitchell, and Jack McVitie, that fear began to change direction. The firm was not broken only from the outside. It was rotting from within.